Hello and welcome to the Sociology of Sexualities. I'm Tina Fetner. This is the optional supplementary material for Module 8, Religion, Family, and Sexuality. We're going to start with religion. Religion has had historically a very important role in being the center of morality and establishing what right and wrong is regarding sexual behavior and sexuality. From this historic role, religious institutions of all different kinds of religions have been very important regulators of sexuality, regardless of the actual content of religious beliefs. Every religious institution has taken it upon themselves to be the place where rules are decided around what kind of sex and sexuality is good and what kind of sex and sexuality is bad. In this regulation of sexuality, sexuality has been put forward as a fundamental key component of one's personal morality, right? And so from a religious perspective, this often is tied to the potential for having a positive afterlife, for example, or for being a good person, or for being judged, and for communicating perspectives on what is right and wrong. Sexuality has been central, right? And religious authorities have put themselves as gatekeepers to what moral sexuality looks like. So you take up the perspective of, for example, Christianity, but this is true of many, many religions. The path to moral sexuality leads through marriage, right? And so marriage is the place where one can have moral sexual relations, right? And have children appropriately and do sex kind of right and good. And who gets to marry whom and what that process is all about, of course, is also the province of religious institutions, right? Who meet with couples to decide whether they can have a religious ceremony at a particular church or other religious institution. They often do kind of religious training and talk about how to raise children in a religious institution. And so by being gatekeepers to marriage and to the ritual that places you from unmarried to married, that is weddings, and then also by being gatekeepers to whom can get unmarried through kind of divorce regulations, religious institutions have been central to kind of being the path through which moral sexuality unfolds. Most of the time, religious institutions have a very restrictive view of what moral sexual activity looks like, a very narrow kind of understanding of what appropriate sexuality is. And most of the time, this is marked in similar ways across religious institutions. For example, mostly heterosexual, mostly within the bounds of marriage, and the most common, although not universal, aspect of restrictive sexuality is that good sexuality is the kind that produces children, and other kinds of non-procreative sexualities are more suspicious or immoral, right? And so, for example, the Catholic Church is has had a very restrictive understanding, being opposed to even birth control, recommending only sort of natural family planning methods, even though most Catholics don't necessarily follow that prescription, that this is still the sort of central moral teachings of the Catholic Church, that their only understanding of moral sexuality is procreative sexuality. Other churches are a little bit looser, but almost always marital, and except for very recently, has been very centered around heterosexuality and men marrying women. I want to give you a little picture of the religious membership today. Of course, the things have really changed lately. In the last 50 years or 60 years, we've seen a decline in the religiosity of Canadian people, and this is part of a kind of broader decline in religiosity in Europe and North America as well. But sometimes students aren't really aware of the sort of balance of religious membership across the country, and so I think it's important to know kind of proportionally what are we talking about in terms of how many Canadians follow or belong to what kinds of religions, right? And so take a look at these statistics and have a look at that. There is about 40% of the country that is Catholic, right? And so this includes most of Quebec, right, whose French heritage is closely tied to the Catholic Church. But there are Catholics all throughout Canada, including people who trace their roots back to Italian families and Latin American families. Catholicism in Canada has a very strong presence. This is one of the things that distinguishes Canada from the United States, where a much higher proportion of the country is Protestant. Almost half of Americans are sort of trace themselves back to Protestantism, and even more if you define it kind of broadly in terms of how people kind of orient their religious ideas, right, as opposed to this figure, which is, are you tied to a particular church or other religious institution? One of the things that's important to know is that this third bullet point, the no religion category, has been growing dramatically over time. This is the fastest growing group. Since the 1960s, where the figure of people who would say they had no religion was very small, under 5% of the country would have said that they're not tied to any religious institution. And now almost a full quarter of the country, and I think these are 2011 statistics, I would imagine that this is over a quarter of the country now that would say that they are not tied to any religion. This isn't necessarily the same as saying that they do not believe in God. This means that they're not tied to a religious institution. And then take a look at the smaller sort of religious orientations of different kinds of population. And of course, these have been affected by immigration patterns and by the kind of changing demographics of Canada. 3.2%, according to the 2011 National Household Survey, 3.2% of Canadians are Muslim, and this number is growing. Right? You can compare that, for example, to the 1% of the country that is Jewish. This has been a very steady population in Canada, but the population being steady, as the population grows, this has seen slight declines, right? So the proportion of the population that's Jewish has been in decline. Other kinds of proportion of the populations, we have Orthodox, which is mostly Christian Orthodox in that 1.7%, and then we have about 1.5% of Canadians are Hindu, and another almost 1.5% are Sikh, and 1% are Buddhist, and everybody else falls into kind of other category. One of the things that's really important to the study of sexuality is understanding how religion and the state work together. And I like to talk through the various kind of range of the ways that religion and the state can work together through the example, a historic example from England. Right, so here we have right here, you may recognize him, King Henry VIII, a very famous and some would say infamous King of England. And here we are in 1534, and King Henry looks very stunning in his fabulous outfit, bedecked in much jewelry, very prominent a codpiece and lots of plumage, I would say. So this story should be familiar to you, and if it's not, do a little bit more digging than the very brief overview you're going to get from this class. But in 1534, King Henry is all done with his wife. He is not getting the male heir that he is looking for. He has a daughter at this point, which of course is just not good enough, and he is looking for a son. So he asks the Pope if he can get rid of his old wife, annul the marriage, and get a new wife, remarry. He's not getting any younger, and he needs an heir to uphold the monarchy of the state of England as a state. The Pope, however, being in charge of the religious organizations, Catholic Church, Pope Clement VII says, Henry, no, when you got married, you made this vow for life and for all of eternity and the afterlife, and you are tied to Catherine of Aragon for life. You cannot divorce. So what does Henry do in this situation? His whole legacy is in the balance. He cannot pass on the crown to his daughter. He has no son to pass on the crown to, and he and he's plus has the hots for Anne Boleyn, and he wants a new wife. So what does he do? He breaks off from the Catholic Church and creates a new church. And thus the Church of England is born. And who is the head of it? Not the Pope anymore, but in fact, King Henry himself is the head of the Church of England. And he decides as the head of the church that he can divorce if he wants to, and thus his problem is solved. Now I bring this example forward to you in the study of sexuality to show, first of all, how closely tied sex and sexuality is to these central institutions like religion and like the state. In this case, King Henry's sexual appetites were fundamental to the creation of this important church, the Church of England, that became a central institution, not only in England, but throughout the Commonwealth, including in Canada. This example is an example of religion and the state being tightly coupled, right? The phrase tightly coupled talks about how linked two social institutions are, right? Religion on the one hand, state on the other hand. When the Church of England and the country of England are both headed by the same man, and what he says in one realm goes for the other realm, that is, the laws of the Church of England are the laws of the country of England, then religious state are pretty much the same, and the way that we refer to this is tightly coupled. In the same case, in England, 400 years later, in 1936, we have another king. This year is King Edward VIII, and he also wants to arrange his sexual life in a way that is inconsistent with the rules of the church. In this case, the Church of England, which still is fairly restrictive if you're not King Henry on on divorce, and very judgmental about not allowing divorces, and especially not seeing as legitimate the king's marrying a divorced woman, right? Not to mention that she is also American, so it's doubly scandalous, divorced and American. In this case, King Edward is the nominal head of the church, but he's clashing with the other leaders of the Church of England, and also he is clashing with the people who are surrounding him in the state. In the last 400 years, England as a country underwent a lot of political reform, and now there's a parliament that's running the laws, right? And now even though the monarchy still exists, it's not the same kind of monarchy that just dictates the policy of the country. There's a whole political system that governs the country, and the king can no longer just do whatever he wants, the way that King Henry can. Right, so what did and then I also should mention, secretly he's kind of a Nazi, so nobody really liked him. They were also nervous on that case. And so did he start a new Church of England? Did he start a new Church of King Edward? No. In fact, he abdicated the throne and passed the throne down to the next in line, who happened to be his brother. Probably for the best, given the political situation in the late 1930s and the fact that World War II was about to break out. It's not entirely clear what side England would have come out on, but his abdication sort of helped the political situation, and Winston Churchill was on the side of good in that one. This is another case. England is still very tightly coupled between religion and the state, right? They both aligned against the idea of the king marrying the divorced woman, and in order to rule, he had to organize his sexuality in a way that was consistent with religion, and so his option was to stop, in that case, stop ruling the country. I'm going to give you an example now of a case where the state and religion are more loosely coupled. Right, so we're going to turn to Canada in 1971. Right, perhaps you recognize Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. At this time in 1971, he is 51, and as you can see from the way he is gazing, you could say lovingly, you could say hungrily, at Margaret Sinclair there, who is much younger than he is at 22. There is a bit of a scandal. Pierre Trudeau is divorced. He is leader of the country, and he also, just like all these other kings, he wants to marry someone that neither religion nor the state is particularly happy about. His organizing of his sexual life in this way. But in Pierre Trudeau's case, the religion and the state are very loosely coupled. Right? In Canada, we don't have a state religion. Right? At one time we had the Anglican Church that had a more central role. We have not a state. We'd like to imagine maybe that we have a state that is devoid of religion. We have a secular state. But in fact, of course, the dominant religions, in this case, the Catholic Church and Protestant churches such as the Anglican Church and the United Church of Canada, and the whole sort of suite of Protestant churches that are strong forces in the country, have had a lot of influence on state policies, and but not that much influence, right? Divorces by 1984 were fairly easy to get. They're not as there's not as simple as in some countries, not just simply a place where you can say, oh, we just both feel like divorcing and we can put that in. The state still has kind of a strong role in deciding who can get divorced, and they put some restrictions on married couples before they can do that. But you go through that and then you can get divorced. Moreover, the most important part is that Pierre Trudeau could be prime minister, could organize his sexuality in whatever way he wanted, despite the scandalous nature of his choices. And he did not have to step down from his role of prime minister. He did not have to abdicate his role as a political leader just because he was being judged by some religious institutions or another. This is a case of loosely coupled. So religion and the state kind of operate in the same direction, but there's space between what they do. Right? And if you think about how states and religions operate today, if you look at different states around the world, right, different countries around the world, Canada is a case of a loosely coupled system. Probably even today, England is a case of a more loosely coupled system. But other countries are more tightly coupled, right? So Arab states, for example, like Saudi Arabia, is a case of a tightly coupled monarchical system. And this is true to different extents, there's kind of a range, right? So in some places, for example, in Latin America, the Catholic Church has a stronger influence than in other cases. And so it's important to understand the relationship between the religion and the state in understanding policy that regulates sexuality. Moving on to the state's role in officiating marriages, in being involved in weddings. The states have sort of taken over from many churches about who specifically can marry whom. They still allow in Canada religious oversight of the wedding ritual. In many cases, the weddings are performed by religious clergy. But you don't need to go through religion in order to get a state-sanctioned marriage, right? And I just would like to point out, and sometimes this seems too obvious to say, but it's really important to understand that marriage is a really important social institution that produces widespread and effective regulation of sexuality. There are still sort of a ton of controls in place that regulate and surveil exactly down to the level of the individual who in particular is allowed to marry whom, and in doing so legitimizing some kinds of sexual relationships and delegitimizing other kinds of sexual relationships. And so although when we think of weddings, we might think of fun parties that seem very kind of all about just a celebration and therefore not very important to sexual regulation, I would disagree. Right? Weddings, in fact, are an important part of the social order. I draw back to Emile Durkheim on this, who talks about rituals as being fundamental to developing society and to understanding who we are, and very much about drawing boundaries between who is us and who is not us or who is them. And even as weddings celebrate lifelong unions between two people who are hopefully perfectly matched and are going to support each other for life and celebrate love, etc., they also form an important social role in legitimating what sexual partners are acceptable and what sexual partners are not acceptable, right? And so they do this through, there's Emile Durkheim right there. Emile's always watching over us, looking at our social rituals there. They do this through the marriage contract, right? And so the state, on its own, defines the marriage contract, specifies particular legal responsibilities. For example, when you get married to somebody, your property arrangements are determined by the policy that's in place at the moment that you're married. It determines parenting responsibilities, and so this is why when marriage is dissolved, the state is responsible for deciding who gets custody, who is responsible for parenting, and who, in what proportion, etc. And it specifies the conditions of dissolution of marriage or divorce. Right, so when Canada expanded its marriage law to include same-sex partners in 2005, it was doing really important work, not only to just sort of practically allow same-sex couples to have access to marriage and to sort of join in that social institution, but also to legitimize same-sex partners as, in the eyes of the state, equal and, sort of appropriate and good sexual partnerships under the eyes of the law, and also to incorporate them into the social institution. It's important to note that the Canadian state, anyway, also governs and regulates sexual relationships even when people aren't married, right? And just when you have cohabiting couples in many provinces, although there's some variation from province to province. If you live together for a certain amount of time, usually about a year, the state just considers you kind of equivalent to married and sort of imposes the similar kinds of legal responsibilities onto your relationship, onto your family, onto your parenting and property that are kind of equivalent to a marriage contract. So the state is intervening and setting policy on your sexual relationships in many cases whether or not there is a marriage contract. Okay, so that's where I will leave you today. As you carry on with the work of the class, please complete Module 8, which you'll find on Avenue to Learn. Please do all of the readings in the textbooks and linked, and then just be very careful and cautiously, gently tend to the wounds of the weekly quiz. You don't want to hurt it with all of your powerful knowledge on this topic. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.